Thank you for joining. My name is Esperanza Guevara, Managing Director with the Latino Media Collaborative. Thrilled to be partnering with Free Press and our partners today to bring you today's webinar on challenging election lies targeting Latinos and immigrants. To open our program, I'd like to introduce Arturo Carmona, founding president of the Latino Media Collaborative, Galo News, founder of Sunu Strategies, an advisory board member for the California Local News Fellowship at UC Berkeley, which is a groundbreaking multi-year state-funded initiative to strengthen local journalism across the state, among a few other hats. So Arturo, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Esperanza. And thank you, Jessica and Free Press, for putting this very important event together in partnership with the Latino Media Collaborative. Very excited to have this conversation. We know and have been following the importance that this election represents. It's consequential in so many ways. And it feels like we've said this before, but this time, feels like we say it every election, but this time it's really reached a decibel that we haven't seen before in so many levels. And the topic that we're going to be talking about today is disinformation impacting Latinos, immigrants, young people, and we know that Latinos are significantly overrepresented in those two categories, and so we're looking forward to that conversation. I'm particularly excited to hear about the nexus it will have with news and with journalism, because the Latino Media Collaborative focuses so much on empowering news media outlets, protecting journalism, particularly as it pertains to Latinos. It's critical, right? As Latino news represent a series of trusted outlets, trusted brands, trusted journalists that have been battered by a down spin in the journalism and the market, but also by attacks from particularly from the right, I would say. And so we're working to protect journalism at the state and federal level. And so definitely looking forward to that conversation and all the partners here. With that, I really wanted to just turn it over to Jessica, who's going to be facilitating the conversation here. Jessica?
Thank you, Arturo. So hello, everybody. I'm Jessica Gonzalez with Free Press. Very proud to be here today, partnering with the Latino Media Collaborative and all these partners here to bring you a dialogue about what is happening, what is happening in our communities. And when I think about what's happening in communities across the nation, I know it's true that millions of immigrants are living quietly and in harmony with native-born residents. We are neighbors, coworkers, and friends, and we're caring for each other across racial, ethnic, and partisan lines. Yet we're rarely seeing those stories on the nightly news or on the front page of the newspaper. Those stories are never going viral on social media platforms. And we're here to ask why. And it's because these kinds of stories don't help the politically powerful in our country, and they don't enrich the profits of corporate media empires. Instead, we are seeing on repeat stories that exploit and demonize immigrants. We see the lie that non-citizen immigrants are voting in droves. We see fabricated stories about Haitian immigrants. We see coordinated campaigns to dissuade Latino and Black people from participating in our democracy. And we're watching foreign and domestic interference campaigns that are promoting false claims such as the US election might not happen or election day will be extended through Thursday this year. Manipulated stories like these have targeted voters of color in the last 4 election cycles, and it's happening again this year. The lies are pervasive in English, Spanish, and other languages too, but I do want to lift up that social media companies are failing in particular to invest enough in non-English content moderation. The intent of the rhetoric here is to scare voters of color from going to the polls. It's to pander to anti-immigrant sentiment, to stir up fear and hysteria, to drive voter turnout of white people who are scared about the changing demographics in our nation, and even to legitimize authoritarian power grabs by sowing distrust in our electoral process. This is how we got the mass shooting of Latinos in El Paso. This is how we got mass violence against unarmed Black people. This is how we got January 6th. And we're gathered here today with some of the foremost experts in this country to say enough already. No more. We're here to expose this crisis and to call on social and traditional media companies to do more to address it. Here's the truth. Most of us don't like all the hate and lies in our media system. Most of us across racial, ethnic, and even ideological lines are tired of seeing so much cruelty play out in our media landscape. That's according to a recent poll that was commissioned by Free Press, which found that 80% of Americans are concerned about false and misleading statements online, and that 72% think social media companies should block racist and hateful language. So today we're here with 4 luminaries in the field to discuss stopgaps to fighting hate and lies that target immigrant, Black, and Latino communities. You'll have a chance to hear from these experts, and then we'll open it up for questions. Please just pose your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen on Zoom, and we'll get to you at the end of these remarks. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jenny Carrion of the Carrion Group. Jenny, you're a seasoned political consultant, and you've been through a number of election cycles. What rhetorical dynamics and media challenges are the same today as when you got started? And how has the media environment changed? What is your analysis of how the media environment is impacting democratic participation in the Latino community?
Buenas tardes, Jessica. Thank you for having me today. I became politically active, organizing walkouts during the 90s in California's Prop 187 era, which I'm sure we all remember. I was one of the class presidents that organized 10,000 students to march out of LAUSD schools. And it's crazy and kind of hard to believe or imagine that here in California, Prop 187 actually did pass. And it passed to deny undocumented immigrants access to public education. It passed to deny social services in our communities. And it also went a step further by requiring police to report and verify immigration status of all individuals, including children. Thankfully, Prop 187 was struck down by the courts, but 30 years later, here we are. We are hearing again the same rhetoric. We're hearing again the same anti-immigration stories and negative stories, but this time it's at a national level. Project 2025 is Prop 187 on steroids. And besides eliminating social programs, it will dismantle the foundation of our immigration system. It will terminate legal status of 500,000 dreamers. It will suspend temporary work visas. And unfortunately, once again, our communities are under attack, and we need to stay vigilant. And one of the things that we're seeing is that these stories are not being told. The impact of these policies are not being talked about, and they're not being talked about in a digestible way that our communities can understand.
Thank you, Jenny. I really appreciate that reflection and your work on Prop 187. I remember the impact of that rhetoric because I was on the schoolyard then.
Yeah.
It was ugly. It was really, really ugly. And I feel like
scary. And it was really scary.
Yeah. And it was hard to process as a kid. You didn't understand why it's happening. Really, really, really important work. I'm going to turn next to Vanessa Cardenas. And Vanessa runs America's Voice, which is a leading communicator in the immigrant rights movement. Vanessa, what anti-immigrant rhetoric and conspiracies are you tracking at AV? How are you correcting the record? And if you could change one thing about social media and mainstream media, what would it be?
Well, first of all, Jessica, thank you so much for hosting us. I think this is such timely conversation and really needed conversation. As you can probably imagine, we could talk about immigration for like 2 hours and still we wouldn't get at all the, sort of the questions that you're posing, but I'm gonna attempt to give you some top lines that hopefully will create some interesting dialogue with the participants. I think it is really important to understand that immigration this year in particular, it is being used as a political strategy to create hate and fear in our communities. And not just with the purpose of fostering distrust, not just in our systems, but also on each other. And I think for me, fundamentally, that is what is so worrisome about how the debate has shifted. And all of you are familiar with what we're hearing about immigration and immigrants day in and day out. And there is, again, a concerted strategy and an echo chamber that has been built to kind of amplify these messages day in and day out. I also want to emphasize that my second point is that this is, if you hear carefully what we're hearing right now, this is no longer just about quote unquote undocumented immigrants. We are now seeing attacks on actual legal immigrants, as we have seen what happened in the last few weeks in Ohio with the Haitian community, which, by the way, most of the Haitians living in that community have TPS, which is legal status. We're also seeing attacks on DACA and other programs that actually have provided legal pathway for our folks. So that is sort of the context in which we are sort of managing and processing everything that's coming to us on immigration. Now, when you ask me about the narratives, I think that for us, there are two buckets. We have the bucket of invasion / open border, great replacement theory bucket, which again speaks to sort of creating that fear and really is pushing that notion that immigrants are here to replace quote unquote real Americans. And in that context, we have seen the rise of what we call the big lie 2.0, the idea that ineligible immigrants are going to vote in our election. And to us, that's really seeding the idea that we're not going to be able to trust our election outcomes. And the danger of promoting that idea is not a danger just of violence, because it is, again, stirring hate and fear, but it's also raising a lot of questions of in communities whether they can actually trust the outcomes in November. The second sort of narrative that we're tracking is this notion around scarcity, crime, racial tensions in communities that we saw, for example, in New York City, in some of the blue cities where migrants were sent by Texas. And of course, again, that goes to the heart of creating fear with each other. We also, again, the example with Ohio, I think that speaks to that sort of narrative and creating that fear. And I think the last point I want to make in terms of the narratives is that all of these narratives are, again, setting the stage to create this idea that it is okay to deport people en masse because these folks are not desirable, these folks are not, again, American, these folks should not be accepted. So it is creating sort of the conditions for our communities to be against each other and accepting of ideas that are extreme and very much racist, because that is at the bottom. At the end of the day, that is sort of what the goal is. Now, what can we do? We pray. We do a lot of defense work. Fact checking, correcting the record, countering disinformation. But I think what we need to be doing as advocates or even just as members of our community is really tell the real story of immigration. The idea that immigration and immigrants have always been part of the American genius, that they are part of our American story. And also this notion that we as a nation are able to manage migration, right? That this is not this terrible thing that's happening to us that is impossible to solve. The United States of America can manage migration in a way that's consistent with our values, but it also in a way that's orderly, right? And we need to start saying the truth, because it's really important to, again, not just be on the defense, but also on offense, and really paint a picture of what a functional system could look like and what cities and communities are doing to help us, pave the way. So that's one thing. And then the last thing I will say is that, again, I think if we could ask platforms in the media to do, what could they do? Again, tell the real story of migration. but also talk about the impact that some of these policies like Project 2025, like mass deportation, the real impact that would have on our families, and not just immigrant families, but American families, and also in our economy. And I think for the platforms, I think it's really unfortunate that the business model is actually profiting off hate. I think ultimately platforms need to deplatform these, actors, bad actors, and communities that have been built that are fostering hate and fear. And ultimately, that needs to be the goal. And of course, content moderation is part of that by more moderators, not just in Spanish, but other languages. I think also lifting up more positive content, accurate content is part of that. I think the question for me has always been whether the interventions that social media can implement are congruent with the damage. And I am very hesitant. I mean, for me, I don't know that there's an argument that actually says that the interventions match the damage. And I think that's something that we need to be talking about in the context of what can be done. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vanessa. And you've actually segued beautifully because I'm about to bring in my colleague, Tia Oso, who used to work at the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and now runs Media 2070, which is a project about repair. Media 2070 has documented a long history of anti-Black harm in the media, and it believes to achieve full freedom and democracy that we must change entrenched media narratives about Black people. So Tia, I'm guessing you weren't too surprised when you heard the racist and xenophobic narratives circulating around Haitian immigrants. Can you help put this moment in context for us and explain to us why so many Americans could believe and buy into this narrative?
Yes, absolutely. Can everyone hear me okay? I first just want to thank everyone on this webinar, and especially, speaking to Vanessa, the things that you started to lift up about the ways that our political candidates are using immigration to create a political boogeyman, to try to dissuade people from voting or to try to persuade people, playing on fears and playing on stereotypes, to try to get people to stir up anti-immigrant sentiment. And then to be even more specific about the anti-Haitian xenophobia, anti-Haitian hysteria, the reason why we have to ask ourselves all these questions that you just posed, Jessica, about why would people believe this? Why would media outlets be so quick and eager to present these really sensationalized headlines? And I think that we have to talk, really frankly and clearly about the fact that, anti-Blackness, anti-Black xenophobia are playing a role here, and also a long history of media harm, a long history of media harm against Haiti in particular. For folks who may not be familiar with the history, Haiti is the first nation in the Western Hemisphere to outlaw slavery. It is the first free Black republic. And that has always been scary to the United States power system, this idea of self-determination by Black people. Of course, during enslavement, this idea of people becoming free and overthrowing slavery, and this work of abolition. And so even the idea that Haiti, the existence of Haiti, is a threat to United States power. And so instead of pointing the finger on, putting the lens on the United States and why we'd be afraid of liberation, we want to demonize Haiti, demonize Haitian people. And so that is rooted both from the emancipation of Haiti, the self-emancipation of Haiti, as well as the ongoing tactics by the United States government to control the Haitian government, to extract wealth from Haiti, the United States occupation of Haiti. They made sure to send back reports about how uncivilized Haitians were, and how Haitians are not to be trusted. And so all of these rumors of things like eating pets and sacrificing animals and doing voodoo create this boogeyman of what Haitians are. The work of, immigrant rights and, having more immigration by people of color and from African and Caribbean countries into the United States. If you look at, stories in even the New York Times from the 70s, 80s, and 90s about Haitians, again, it feeds into this idea that these people are uncivilized, these people are barbaric, they're not like us. they're bringing disease, they're bringing crime, all in order to undermine, right, what should be a very inspiring story about people who threw off the yoke of oppression. And even now today, the stories of the Haitian immigrant population being welcomed into Ohio and welcomed into Springfield, revitalizing their economy, that should be a feel-good story. But instead, we see our media outlets perpetuating sensationalized accounts that were not verified and were not vetted. If it's the work of journalism to tell the truth, why didn't anyone investigate these really horrific stories and these really horrific lies? And the answer is racism. The answer is because it plays into our dominant ideas and frameworks that are so entrenched. And so it's really important for us to understand that. It is important for us to understand that specificity around Haiti itself, because those underlying narratives are what is at play. And in order to correct the narratives and to tell the truth, we have to tell the truth about that. And we have to be willing to reckon with the fact that racism is what's underlying these stories, as well as xenophobia. We have to be willing to tell the truth about the fact that the reason why so many Haitian immigrants and so many folks from other countries are coming to the United States is because the United States has destabilized their economies, destabilized their governments, and that United States foreign policy is a pull factor for immigrants to come to the United States. And I know those stories on those issues are complex, but we have to tell the truth. And then we also have to tell the truth about the fact that we have political candidates who are wanting to manipulate that racism, manipulate that xenophobia, manipulate these ideas of scarcity in order to keep the United States population scared and divided, when really at the heart of what is happening in Springfield before these really hateful lies started to be spread by presidential candidates and vice presidential candidates is that the city of Springfield was seeing revitalization, that the city of Springfield, yes, was dealing with tension, but people were overcoming them, that people were starting small businesses, people were learning new ways to come together and create unity. And that hasn't been the story. And now, because of these lies and because of these sensationalized headlines, we're seeing people be put into danger, not just residents in Springfield, but also Haitian journalists. We've seen people calling bomb threats to the Haitian Times, for example. And so I just think that it's important for us to be really specific about what's happening, tell the truth about what's happening, and also really thoughtful, careful reporting will also be honest about the media's role in perpetuating these conditions and also working to repair them.
Yeah, really, really powerful, Tia. Thank you so much for really getting the specifics down about the history of storytelling of lies and hate and racism about the Haitian community. It's a bedrock that's sitting underneath the current iteration of hate and disinformation. I wanna bring in Roberta, who runs the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas. Roberta, at DDIA, you have been tracking trends in disinformation targeting Latinos online, and you've been providing resources to counter it as well. Can you give us a brief overview of the most recent trends and then spend some time on how all of us can effectively push back on disinformation? I also know you have some tools, which we will be sure to share in the Zoom. It's like very practical. Like, we can definitely and should make demands of media companies, but also we all as community members have a role to play to stand up to this. So why don't you bring us into that?
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's great to be here with all of you. So Vanessa and Tia really painted a picture already, I think, of a lot of what we call the meta narratives that get told about immigrant communities. And as you mentioned, Jessica, at DDI, we're looking at how narratives and claims spread in Latino spaces online, both targeted at our communities, but also spread by our own communities in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And so I wanted to point out three, I guess, trends. The first is the meta narratives focus trend. So this is the trend that narratives are never entirely new. And I think Tia brought this up, Vanessa brought this up. These narratives, these stories that get told about the world, they are sometimes massively twisted. They may have a grain of truth to them, but they're very out of context or they're very manipulated. And they're never so new that you've never seen them before. In fact, when it comes to disinformation, a lot of the things that we see is very much recycled, and that is no different for immigration-related disinformation. And so at DDIA, we've really identified, I think, like 2 meta-narratives and some claims that are very common that associate with those 2 meta-narratives. The first one Vanessa mentioned is that this false narrative that immigrants are somehow responsible for the supposed decline of America, that they are ruining the fabric of our society. And under that meta narrative, we often see things like non-immigrants are voting in elections, or all immigrants are criminals and members of gangs. And the second meta narrative is really one that that really paints, I think, all of our communities as monolithic, and I think that tries to pit migrants that have been in the United States for decades with new migrants. That one is not new, but it is something that we've seen growing, I think, this year. And so one approach to countering disinformation from our perspective is not getting bogged down in the specific claims, but rather tackling those 2 meta narratives that I mentioned. And Vanessa brought up painting a picture of a better world, a world that we want to live in, telling stories about immigrant communities. And I think that's a great investment by our communities. We don't have to correct the record on everything we see. And in fact, I'll talk about the tactics that get used a lot. We shouldn't do that. Instead, I think we really should focus on changing the conversation and pivoting away from those claims. The second trend that we see, Jessica, is the tactics. The tactics are also recycled. They are also not very new. I don't know if this is necessarily a silver lining of disinformation spread. Sometimes I call it that, but it's not a positive thing. So I wanted to just point out some manipulation tactics that we see being used over and over. The first one's emotional language. I don't think that surprises anyone here. A lot of bad actors spreading immigration-related disinformation are using fear-mongering. They're playing at people's very real anxieties about their day-to-day lives, and just overall using very, very toxic, violent, black and white language to try to scare folks. The second tactic that we see a lot in immigration spaces is cherry picking. So a lot of bad actors will take 1 or 2 cases, perhaps of a crime being committed by a migrant in the United States, and try to frame that instance as applicable to all migrant communities. And the third tactic, I think, really is this false dichotomy tactic. False dichotomies are used to present 2 options, and it's often getting framed as 2 options that are mutually exclusive. Either you have this or you have that, and it leaves out all of the other potential options that you have. And so we see bad actors also using false dichotomies a lot. And so my second recommendation then is to counter misinformation, focus on the meta narratives, focus on the tactics. So like really expose the motive behind a specific story that's being told, focus on the tactics that don't change that often. And then you mentioned the tools, Jessica, so I'll end there. At DDIA, we've done a lot of polling and we've done a lot of experimentation, polling to understand to what extent online harms are impacting our communities. For example, to what extent are Latinos seeing and believing different disinformation narratives and claims? And we've also done experiments on solutions and how we can adapt solutions to be more culturally competent for our communities. So just a few tips along those lines. The first is, remember that the majority of people are not believing everything they see online, and Latinos are absolutely a part of that. So our poll this year showed that 62% of Latinos are either not sure of what they're seeing or they're rejecting these claims. And so I think we need to really focus on targeting the uncertain, not necessarily the people that are all the way down the rabbit hole. And then on the tools specifically, I would say we need to remember that we're talking to friends, neighbors, people who might be not sure, right? And so I think there's a degree to which we need to respect the audience's intelligence, not shame people, not call people out directly, call out the bad actors. But when you're talking to your communities, right, don't frame your communities as being victims necessarily, because that can generate a lot of defensive energy from people. Back assertions with evidence, right? Don't just present your points with relevant quotes and numbers and perspectives from different experts, show and tell. And then I would say, to the extent, and this is very, very related to pre-bunking specifically, so kind of correcting the record before someone sees disinformation online. I think it's important to build credibility with the messenger. And so something that we see for especially journalists in the room is pre-bunking is not political persuasion. And so in pre-bunking, you should identify messengers that can be perceived as neutral, unbiased, and then just identify your messenger, sort of tell a story about who that person is and why people should engage with them. And we've shown from focus groups and surveys, people really respond well to simple things like just putting someone's name in a video or mentioning the organization they're from. People really, they report consuming a lot of information from influencers and content creators, but very rarely do they actually remember people's names. They remember their behavior. And so people have told us, oh, I really like this girl and she's always talking about this thing. I can't remember her name, but she always goes on a whiteboard and she shows me what she's saying, and she like writes things out. And I really like that because I know I can trust her. And so those are just, I think, some broad tips, and I can definitely share both a deck and some links with additional resources for folks that are producing content for communities.
Thank you, Roberta. I mean, I've been doing this for a while, and I learned a ton from what you released a couple of weeks ago. So please drop that in the chat. No Spanglish hit me. I was like, oh, I love Spanglish. I better like tuck in my shirt about that. That's like,
Just in super produced
well,
content.
said it's not okay, so I'm not going to do it anymore, you know. There's a lot of really, really helpful tips there. And so thank you so much, Roberta. You're making me think about, as a group, we're going to go to Q&A in a minute, and there's lots of really good questions in the Q&A already. If you have more, please drop them in. But you're making me think about like, what should news media and social media influencers and just members of communities, what should we be pre-bunking right now? Because we know that we might not have election results on election day. We know that there is a lie that non-citizens are voting. Like, what else? Like we probably ought to be pre-bunking those false claims. Is there anything else like that anyone wants to popcorn in here about other claims that we ought to be pre-bunking?
I mean, I think I would take a shot at that. I think it's really important to strengthen the faith and the trust in our systems, you know, and I think that's really hard for us truth tellers, sort of, you know, progressive warriors that are trying to fix the system. Because, you know, we focus on like things that need to be fixed, but I think there is a role for us to play in reassuring folks that we can trust our electoral outcomes. I think I want to underscore the importance of messengers. And many times we focus on national messengers. And the truth is that people really believe the people that they know best, right? And more often that is people in their own communities. The organizer that has been organizing, you know, people for a long time, the leader of the local nonprofit, the doctor, the nurse. So those are actually, I think, the messengers that we really want to engage early on to help us build trust. I also want to say that things are so dire in our political discourse that I think people are really hungry for positivity, you know, and that's why I think my plea to you all is to share your positive stories, you know, share your successes, especially as it relates to immigration. I'm going to put in the chat, we kind of soft launched a campaign called Reclaiming Our Story. And our hope is that this is a long-term campaign where people, regular people, are talking about, you know, who they are as immigrants and the success stories of their fathers and mothers, their tios, their tias, because that's the kind of thing that we need. So I would say more positive, more uplifting, more trust is something that we need to really focus on and really rebuilding that trust. And also talking about the systems that are already in place to make sure that our elections work. It's really important.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Vanessa. Jenny, let me bring you in here, and then we're going to go to another question because there's so many that we won't have enough time to get to all of them. Come on in.
Yes, I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Vanessa was sharing. Besides positive stories and amplifying those, I think we as a community need to do a stronger job at educating our new voters on the mechanics of how to vote. I know I've been doing this work for a long time, but even when I get a ballot, it's a thick piece of paper. It's a long, you have to sit down and go through it. And taking time to teach new voters. We're a generation of new voters in this country, and teaching each other how that works, how it is if you're going to do it from home, or how it works if you're going to go to the polling location, so it's not as intimidating, and our new citizens don't feel so apprehensive about the actual system and participating with excitement, like I know all of us on this Zoom are doing.
Thank you, Jenny. I want to take the next question and maybe go to you, Tia. It's from Gabriel Sanchez, and he's asking, what are some success stories of journalists and news outlets being called out and practices and coverage changing? Like, what is the model that you're seeing? Because y'all are focused on the future, and like, what is the positive vision for the future? Is anyone kind of doing it already? And what does it look like?
I would point to things like the Los Angeles Times apology, where that's a major media outlet at least taking responsibility for their role in perpetuating anti-Blackness. I'll also point to a campaign that the Black Alliance for Just Immigration participated in during my time as the organizer, where we successfully lobbied the Associated Press to stop using the term illegals in their coverage. And of course, a certain candidate resurgence on the scene, put it right back into that media discourse. But I just want to point to those as examples of a successful organizing, as well as media outlets taking responsibility for their coverage and trying to make a stated commitment to do better. Is that organizing often is the thing that gets the goods.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I can think of so many campaigns when this really started, the anti-immigrant rhetoric really started kicking up after the 2006 immigration marches. And there was so many important campaigns to call out people who were spreading straight up xenophobic, racist lies. The Drop Dobbs campaign, the John and Ken, Stop John and Ken campaign, where they were literally talking about committing violence against immigrants. So there's been a lot of important organizing, and there are newsrooms that are trying to do things differently as well. I don't want to suggest that it's everyone, but the corporate media incentive structure is definitely a problem here. I wanted to go down to the next question by, I'm going to try the name and I might mess it up, Nahiara Alonso. Are there different narratives of disinformation targeting Latinos depending on what states they live, what countries of origin they have? Do you have examples of this, and what narratives work best for different diasporas? I think, Roberta, I'm going to go to you with this one, and if other folks want to jump in after, that'd be great.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm Brazilian, so Nayara, I would pronounce your name Nayara, but I don't know that that's correct. But great question. Thank you for asking this. So from what we've seen, and at DDI, we're both testing narratives and claims to see like how much people are seeing them through polls, but we're also doing narrative analysis, which means that we're monitoring and listening to content being spread on social media and also on WhatsApp public groups. And what we've seen is that most narratives are very cyclical and they're very borderless. It is really hard to keep a narrative to one state or to one community, right? Most of the things that are circulating between borders, between states, widely enough, often between platforms. Very rarely do you see something that stays only in one platform and doesn't get shared beyond that. We've seen that what predicts or what correlates whether members of Latino communities in the United States are engaging with this information more or not is not necessarily what country they're from or what state they live in or even their age or gender. It's their behavior. For example, our research showed that it's people who have really high levels of interest in politics, who have very conspiratorial tendencies and who consume news and information in very hyper-partisan spaces that both see and believe disinformation more often. And so while we definitely want to be doing more work to see what is unique to different communities and people from different countries of origin, most of what we see today is spreading widely enough. The one thing I'll say is there is a difference between content that spreads mostly among white Americans and Latino Americans. But even still, a lot of what we see spreading among Latinos often is spreading in English. It will be spreading in English and Spanish among Latinos, or it may get co-opted and changed up. The one thing I'll note here, and I'll close on this, is I do think people assume that Latinos have certain like shared experiences or values that they do try to target. For example, the communism narrative that Kamala is a communist, or Camarada Kamala is a term we've seen unfortunately being coined lately, does, I think, attempt to play at Latin Americans' experiences who have come from countries whose governments have not served them, or who might have authoritarian governments that are very extreme. But today, I think most things are wide enough that they're just everywhere. I don't know, Vanessa, if you've seen anything specific, but that's mostly of what we've seen.
Maybe this one is for you. This one's coming in from Brandy from NBC. How have you seen the non-citizen voting law specifically impact Latino communities? Vanessa, can we start with you
Sure.
on that one? Thank you.
Well, here's the thing. How do you know that I am a citizen or not? And if I show up to vote, how do you know when either of us, Roberta or Jessica or I, are citizens? And that's exactly the fear that that we have, that as our communities show up to vote, and then you have these bad actors spreading these lies, you would have, people that are going to intimidate voters. So that is very real, right? It creates sort of the idea that, if you show up, there could be some violence, that people are going to question whether you're eligible. We also know, based on research, and this is not like immigration research, but based on groups that work on voting rights, that, for example, Latinos have hyphenated last names, right? Which sometimes creates a barrier for them to verify their identity. We also know that low-income folks have a harder access to like documentation to prove their citizenship, right? So all of these factors contribute to this idea of like, it is going to be harder for Latinos to prove that they're actually US citizens and they can vote. And the last thing I would say is that, of course, we all want for eligible citizens to be able to vote. So we should be making every effort to communicate that to communities. And that should be the default, not putting more barriers that we know are going to affect our communities, and particularly communities that traditionally have had a harder access to voting.
Yeah, Jessica, I would add two things really quickly to that. So we were speaking with some Congress members this week, and a Congress member pointed out to us that the two documents that you need to prove that you're a citizen are your birth certificate and a passport. Nothing else is sufficient proof. And so if you think about the voters that would have access to both a birth certificate and a passport printed there, right there, most young voters aren't going to have access to a birth certificate. They may not have a passport because they're not traveling yet. And so I think that to Vanessa's point, like when you really think about the voter suppression tactic that's happening here through fear, who ends up being affected by that, it will be Latinos, I think, because of the racist stereotypes, but it will also be many other voters who may or may not be Latinos, who are young or who don't have enough income to be getting passports, right? So who knows? But I think that the repression is far and wide there. And then the other thing I would say to Brandy's question, Brandy, so we actually have seen, we track both English and Spanish. There is a higher level of English language non-citizens voting disinformation being spread in Spanish, but we do see it circulating in Spanish as well. But I do think the effect that it's having is that it is starting to pit Latinos who've been in the United States for generations or for a long time, for decades, against new migrants. And it's kind of formed this, to Vanessa's point around the like resource scarcity meta narrative, it's formed this environment where people feel like there's an injustice being done to them that isn't really there. Um, and the more you say a lie, the more people believe a lie. Like psychology has shown that. And so it's just really concerning. I think this is like the big lie 2.0, I think, in a way, and we should be really worried about that.
Yeah, I think that was really important characterization, Vanessa, of like, this is the new way that we're gonna mesh anti-immigrant sentiment and a desire to undermine election integrity and trust in the electoral process in the United States. It's really dangerous. It's really and it's not true. I wanna go to a question from Brenda Verano, who asks if we have any tips on talking to older Spanish speakers about disinformation and the importance of fact checking. I'm going to open this up to everyone because I think probably all of us have older Spanish speakers in our families. I know, Roberta, you also have some tactics, but what do you find to be effective?
Jessica, I can very quickly weigh in here.
Why don't you jump us off? Yeah.
I was just going to say the first thing is we should not assume, do not assume that older Spanish speaking people are quote unquote more susceptible to misinformation. I think anecdotally we feel like they are sometimes because we have family and friends that may bring things up. But research has not shown that older people are more prone to believing this information. And neither are Spanish dominants more vulnerable to this. Not inherently, at least, right? If they're consuming certain news and information, perhaps. And so I would say don't approach them as if they are dumb or gullible or stupider than you are, right? And I think that goes back to the tactics we talked about, which I can share is like talk to people, respect their intelligence, respect where they're getting in their information from, question, ask very subtle questions that will lead them to connect dots about things that they may be seeing that are manipulated. And then I would say there are just some great Spanish language fact checking happening now. And so if you can point them to Fact Chequeado is a great resource. Univision and Telemundo both have fact-checking arms that are producing good content, and I know Univision is even producing some pre-bunking content in Spanish, and so there are places they can go, including WhatsApp tip lines. And so definitely kind of point them in that direction, but I would say don't frame it like you really need this because this is something you should be, be more
Bold. The funny thing is, I also feel like older folks are like the young people. They're always on their phones. We can't trust their judgment either. So this idea of like coming to conversations unloaded with assumptions is important. Anyone else want to get in here and maybe share something that's helped or worked in your own conversations?
I mean, I would just add two things. Messengers matter. And I think when you're thinking about especially your older relatives, I think thinking, maybe you're not the best messenger and there's someone else that would listen, that this person listens to. So I think that's a really important piece. I also want to say that sometimes we spend a lot of time trying to convince people that are not convincible, right? So I want to underscore what Roberta said I think at the top of her remarks, that there's like a large group of Latino voters out there that have not decided and are ambivalent. And I think those are actually where we should be spending most of our time with, having conversations with them, sharing our thoughts and ideas, sharing information with them. I think that actually, those are people that we can actually move to our side, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would add that in having conversation with folks who are persuadable or who may be repeating misinformation or disinformation, I think it's important to, if you have the opportunity to understand what their concerns actually are. A lot of times political rhetoric or misinformation is playing on, valid fears and concerns like around housing or around finances. And so kind of pointing people towards the real solutions. The real solutions for a lot of the issues that people are concerned about is not to be anti-immigrant or not to be racist, right? But to have a government that is actually going to work for us, having, the resources that we need to address these issues. So sometimes those valid fears need to be like spoken to a bit, and then pointed towards like the actual solutions and not these kind of boogeyman and enemies that a lot of misinformation props up.
Yeah. There are so many questions in the chat, and I'm really sorry. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. People want contact info. I could just say, I want you to just email the place where you got the link, and we will connect you as appropriate to the speakers. I want to go, though, to this question from Antonio Gallo, because Antonio is asking, what are the solutions? And I love that question. Because we want to paint the picture for how can we do better. Who wants to jump in here first? I want to give the floor to everyone on this one.
Jessica, I can offer some. So solutions to, I imagine, counter disinformation broadly.
I think the solutions to the problem of the way that immigrants are and Black and Latino folks are being targeted with lies pertaining to the election. Yeah.
So I can focus on solutions that are based on like interventions, and maybe Vanessa or Tia will have additional things to add. So all counter disinformation interventions work. Research has shown, so fact checking, media literacy and digital literacy, pre-bunking, they all work. The issue is they don't work the same way for everyone. And we have to do a better job, I think, of like targeting subgroups of people. To our point earlier, a person that believes 1 in 15 lies may need a fact check, but a person that believes 14 out of 15 lies, that's not what they need. And so I think more research on like who are the people that are engaging and why. I think also a lot of consideration into like other factors that are not just content oriented factors. So to Tia's point, she brought up some anxieties, like real day-to-day concerns people have. I would also say we need to focus on the psychology, the social and the media consumption drivers of this problem. And then Vanessa brought this up, so I just wanted to echo it. I do think that social media companies have fundamentally changed the way that our media ecosystem functions. And like it or not, people have moved away from traditional journalism toward consuming what like the new newsmakers produce, right? The influencers, content creators. And so I think there are also solutions to be had, and this is something VDIA is definitely going to explore next year in supporting content creators and others in their own production, whether that's through connecting them through fact checkers or what have you. But we do need to also just take into account where people are on YouTube, on WhatsApp for Latinos, but also other places, and then make sure that we're reaching them there instead of just throwing things at the wall and assuming it's going to land where we want it to land.
I want to
Yeah,
throw things in the mix.
Go to Vanessa, then Arturo.
Yes, I'm sorry, I don't want to dominate. I want to say things. There's no silver bullet. I know we all want to see what's the solution, and I want to say there's no silver bullet. We have to use all the tools in the toolbox. I also believe that media landscape has fundamentally changed, but Spanish language media is still a big player. There's still a need for media outlets that talk to our community, both online and offline, so we have to engage them. But I think in the long term, what we need to build is an echo chamber, sort of like what the right has done. And the right has not built their echo chamber in a day or a week or a month. It's taking them a long time. And I know that feels like a big task for us, but I think in order to really make a difference in the long term, we are going to have to learn how to coordinate and amplify our message better among ourselves. And I believe if we do that, we will win because there are more of us, but we have to be intentional. But I think this idea that one organization is going to fix this, or 5 organizations in this DC, that's just not the model anymore, because things are not centralized as they used to be. So, and I think that has also implications for state level communications, right? Because to the point I made earlier, people are looking to the local communities, to the people that they trust at the state level, to help them navigate this media landscape. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Vanessa. We're gonna
Yeah.
Arturo, Jenny, Tia, and then I'll bring us home.
And that's a perfect segue to what I was going to say in terms of what Roberta was talking about, the very rapidly changing media landscape impacting Latinos, both from a language standpoint. Younger Latinos aren't consuming as much Spanish content, but then again, we don't have enough outlets speaking to English dominant Latinos. There's been some attempts, Fusion, a few others, but they have not been successful in generating that type of audience. There's emerging efforts like Caló News, headquartered in Los Angeles, that is a part of the Latino Media Collaborative, and it's very exciting efforts there. We've been growing very quickly in terms of audience, but also very strategic initiatives like this Stop the Dis, where we developed a strategic partnership with El Madrigal and a number of other influencers. We've been doing events, a lot of cool content to reach really younger demographics in English, but also give tools to Spanish-speaking outlets. So I just echoing some of the stuff that was said, really meeting people where they're at on social, multi-platform, but also leveraging traditional outlets. On the Spanish side, we can't, to Vanessa's point, we can't forget about Spanish media. It still has an outsized role in our community. It's very trusted brands, but it's not just Univision and Telemundo. They are a behemoth in our community, and they're trusted, and they often do a good job in developing initiatives, and I've been seeing a lot of really good efforts happening, but I am not seeing enough efforts happening with other Spanish outlets at the regional level, especially in battleground states. Mid to smaller size Spanish print and digital outlets that are part or working with the Latino Media Collaborative need to be better engaged, need to be resourced. We're seeing a great, our outlets just continue to get pennies on the dollar when it comes to advertising, when it comes to funding and other resources. So we really need to be looking at the whole spectrum of Latino media consumption. Yes, influencers, which is a big trend, right? It's the thing right now. Yes, the bigger news outlets, but also all of the other areas. Latinos are consuming content very differently now. So I'll stop there.
Arturo, Jenny.
Gallo, thank you for your question, one of our dear friends from Bow Heights. I think we also need to recognize our power. Latino voter misinformation is threatening our democracy because it's undermining the voice of the fastest growing voter demographic in the US. Latinos will be the decisive vote in 2024 elections. We will determine what happens, the outcomes in Nevada. We will determine what happens in the outcomes of Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia, North Carolina. And we have 40 days until the election and a lot of work that we need to do to stay vigilant.
Thanks, Jenny. Tia, solutions.
To add to the solutions that have already been shared, which I would echo what everyone has said, I think that partnering closely with ethnic media, some of the media outlets and platforms that reach our communities the best and are trusted messengers and trusted voices. So strategies around, I know a lot of, for example, immigrant-owned newspapers and Black American-owned newspapers, they pull their stories from things that are sent directly to them, either through news wires or from publicists. And so partnering with things like op-eds and stories and quotes that are good information helps them a lot, right, with their publishing process. And then are things that, you can get directly to these bigger audiences. I think it's also important for us to look at ways that we can amplify one another. Like Vanessa was sharing, look for ways to amplify the good information, look for ways to continue to echo the good information. I know a lot of us folks participating on this call, you are in existing networks of reporters, our media outlets, our nonprofits. So sharing tools and sharing resources can also help facilitate some of that. We're in a time crunch for this election, but that doesn't mean that we don't have some really existing, very strong, powerful existing networks to be proactive with in the time that we do have.
Excellent. I'm just thinking about the echo chamber. Like, what if we had an echo chamber of kindness and accuracy instead of hate and division and just people being mean? Listen, I need to wrap us, unfortunately. I feel like we could have probably stayed here all day. At democracyis.net, you can see the demands that we are making for newsrooms and for tech companies to challenge election lies that are targeting Latinos and immigrants. My colleague Danny is going to drop a couple of resources in the chat now. We'll also follow up after this webinar with the resources that were shared here. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all the many questions. There were so many great questions in the chat, and we really thank you all for participating. Please stay tuned. There will be more programming for the Democracy Is, and I know for the Logo series. So thank you to Latino Media Collaborative and to all of you for being here today. Really appreciate you. And let's go.